So I'll start with a quick question. Do you know a good idea when you see it? And do you know a good deal when you see it? Most of us intuitively think that yes, we find it very easy to perceive what is a good idea, what seems groundbreaking, and something that we should carry forward. But of all the ideas and all the deals that we see and all the offers that we receive, we have to choose between those to work out which are worth taking and which are worth following up. And underlying that decision is the circuitry of our brain and our inherent psychology. So I'm going to be talking to you about whether there's limitations within our psychology and within our own brain circuitry that mean we're not good at making decisions, or we sometimes make poor decisions. So the idea of what's good and what is better is something that's very difficult to pin down. It's very intangible, and that makes it very difficult to measure as scientists. So what we tend to do is try and find something that is similar but simpler. So instead of asking what's better, we can ask what's brighter. So here we can simply ask which is brighter, that spot on the left or the spot on the right. And they're side by side. It's very easy to tell that one on the right is slightly lighter. But it's easy when there's that direct comparison and you can see them side by side. But when I take those away, all it leaves is a kind of fuzzy memory. Your brain doesn't have an explicit way of representing that brightness or betterness. So when I now put another spot back up, people find it very hard to say, is that the same as the light spot or the dark spot? Is it somewhere in between? Which one's it closer to? It's very difficult, but if we then put those other two up, it'll be very simple again. Even harder is if I show you this sliding scale here and ask you to pick the point on that at which the brightness exactly matches the spot you just saw. You're actually going to be quite bad. And when we take the point that people place on here and put it next to that original spot, they can see very quickly and very easily when they're side by side that actually they're hugely different. So let's go back to something that's a little easier and put two side by side again. How about here? Which one seems brighter? One on the left? Yeah? Most people would say that one on the left. But when I then take them out, put them together again, you can see that actually they're exactly the same. This works and is so convincing because the one on the right looks darker in comparison to its very bright background. And the one on the left looks much lighter because it's on that dark background. And what we're finding is that this is a really common theme running through a lot of perception and decision making, and a lot of systems within the brain use this idea of comparison for all of our judgments. So, how do we take this into betterness rather than brightness? Well, scientists in Canada were faced with this exact question, and like many people when faced with a hard problem, they turned to drink. Unlike many people when faced with a hard problem and turning to drink, they found a way to solve their problem with it. And what they did was they invited people in for a wine tasting. They gave them 5 wines, one after the other, and then in the brief interlude between tasting the final wine and falling off their chair, they said which wine they liked the best. And what we find when we look at the proportion of people who preferred the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth is that a lot of people prefer that first one and prefer the last one. Regardless of which wine it actually is, it's the order that matters. Whereas wines 2, 3, and 4 have relatively few people preferring that as their favourite. This is because after tasting that first wine, if you like it, it stays in your head as a very nice taste. You know that you liked it, and you have that fuzzy representation when you come to tasting the second wine. So that second one has to be really good to beat the first one. So then if you then come to the third wine, all you really remember about the first is that it was better than the second. So that's an even higher threshold. And then that only gets stronger as you go on and go on. So that first one has a big boost to its chances of being the favourite. Conversely, if you don't have a strong favourite in that first 4, then by the time you get to the 5th wine, what you're doing is you're comparing the taste of that 5th wine to a vague memory of the previous four not being all that great. So in a sense, what we're seeing here is comparisons, but it's massively skewed by what order you see things in. And this is important because it's exactly the pattern that we find when we ask committees or individuals to make decisions. If we propose 5 different alternatives in a row like this, we find that committees and individuals are far more likely to think that the first or the last options are the best. And this is used every day. Trainee estate agents are always told, if you have one house that you think people want to buy, then either show it first and then lots of mediocre ones afterwards so they immediately fall in love with it, or show them lots of mediocre houses first and then save the best till last so that they're wowed that it's that much better than all the ones they've seen before. So, our research here in Nottingham over the past few years has been aimed at answering a very complicated question. Which is better, 30p or £5? When I put them up like this and say, which would make you happier, if I gave you 30 pence or if I handed over a £5 note, I've yet to meet anyone who chooses 30p. No one thinks that they're too rich. So what we can do is we can kind of skip the middleman and not ask you any questions. And we can put you in a brain scanner. And when we do, we find that offering you money and things that you like makes different areas of the brain respond and get excited. And this area in the middle here is one of the main reward centers within the brain. And this gets very excited when we show you things like money, chocolate and other high-calorie foods, and adult images and things of a sexual nature. So in our research, we have steered clear of the ethical and moral issues associated with the last two, and we've stuck with money here. So we put people in the scanner, and then we get them to play a little game where they can win different amounts of money. So they can win 10 pence, 20 pence, or 30 pence for the first half, so they play that for quite a while. And then in the second half, we let them play for prizes of £5, £7, or £10. And then by doing that, we can see how excited that reward centre gets when they're given these different amounts of money. And what we find is the brain really likes money. So we find this nice effect of there's more and more activity for 10, 20, and 30 pence in that reward centre as we're offering you more and more money. But what's funny is when we look at the other half of the experiment, when it's £5, £7, and £10, it's got exactly the same pattern, but here apparently 30p is making you happier than £5. It's getting that reward centre far more excited. So the reason for that is that reward centre is one of the more primitive regions of brain. We share it very similarly with mice and rodents and all mammals. And that means, in a way, it's very short-sighted. So it's doing the same comparison as we were before with the brighter and darker spots. But now, whenever we see 30 pence, it's being compared to the 20 pence and the 10 pence that we've seen recently, so it always seems like the best thing. Whereas when we see £5, we've recently seen £7 or £10, so it seems like the worst possible thing. So this is a bit of a worry if we're relying on our brains to make complicated decisions and plan our financial futures. So next we can look in this part of brain and see if we can find any other activity that gives us more hope for our intelligence. So these frontal regions here are the areas that are far more developed in humans than in other animals. And these frontal regions are responsible for things like puzzle solving, decision making, and forward planning. So this is, in a way, the highest order of thinking goes on in this area of the brain. So if that part doesn't know that £5 is better than 30 pence, we're in trouble. Thankfully, when we look at that, we do now see that £5 is better than 30 pence, but apparently it's the same amount of better as it was for 20 pence to 30 pence. We've still got this very straight line. And that's because even this part of the brain is still relying on that basic comparison of is it better or is it worse. It's not as short-sighted as that low-level reward system is, but it's still not capable of telling how much better £5 is than 30p. And the upshot of our experiments is we can't find anywhere in the brain that actually responds properly to money. Nowhere that can tell you just how much better £5 is than 30p just on its activity. So people may think that this is just a strange quirk of our tasks or of brain scanners and the activity that we find. But then when we look into the real world, we can find examples where this is happening to everyday people making decisions. Consider when you go to your unscrupulous double glazing salesman or car salesman. They will start off with a very high offer. This seems ridiculous, there's no way you're going to go for it, because you're still comparing that to the price of other cars and other double glazing offers you've seen. But then, as you're talking to them and negotiating, they make a succession of more offers that get lower and lower over time, until eventually, the last one actually seems like quite a good deal. But then, if we can zoom out and see how large that offer really is, it's still incredibly high. But because those previous, even higher offers are now taking up so much space in our working memory and in our heads, that last one seems much lower by comparison. And it's not just mere mortals like you and I who buy cars and double glazing. If we think back to the financial crisis that came to a head in 2008, that was largely the result of the size of risks and gambles being taken by bankers and people who were highly trained in financial decisions. The risk was growing larger and larger gradually over time until it all came to a head and came crashing down. And people seemed blind to that increasing risk. And if we think about what was going on within the head of, our bankers, imagine a new offer coming in here at the right and being compared to the other ones that have been seen recently. And then as more and more come in, the older ones get pushed out. Over time, this is changing depending on the relative good and badness or high and low risk. And because we only have this small window that's changing with that comparison scale, we can't pick out that overall trend. It's very hard for us to tell. But then when we zoom out and take a look at the big picture, we can see just how far we've come. That last offer is many, many times larger than the first one. There's more risk, it's a much higher gamble. But because our brains have such a small window with which to judge the world and make that decision simply by comparing, we just don't see it over time, and bankers couldn't see it over time as clearly as we can now looking back. So essentially what we have is just another version of our original illusion here. The high risk and high value gambles that we were seeing at the end there are like our very light, bright background here. So that makes the risk seem smaller by comparison of an individual, and it makes this spot seem darker. Conversely, down here, the low risk value risks are like our dark background that make a medium risk seem bigger and a medium dot seem brighter. So the take-home message from this really is, be careful about trusting your brain. Whenever you're making decisions, try and zoom out and see that big picture, because we are so heavily biased by the recent context of everything that we've seen. It makes decision-making actually very difficult, and we become quite bad at it. Thank you.